He counted the steps. 10. Exactly 10 steps from gate B24. That's where Selim Virex stood every single morning. Tall, still, expensive suit, cold eyes scanning the arrivals board like he owned the terminal. Maybe he did. Men like Selim owned most things they touched. Saran Adiz knew that better than anyone. He pressed his back against the far glass wall, one hand resting low on his stomach. The coat he wore was too big now. Not because he lost weight. The opposite. The fabric pulled forward just slightly, where the pregnancy had started showing in ways that a loose cut could no longer fully hide. He wasn't supposed to be here. He told himself that every morning. And every morning he came back anyway. The terminal was loud in the way airports always are. Rolling luggage, gate announcements, toddlers crying somewhere past security. But where Saran stood, it felt completely quiet. Because he was watching something that swallowed every other sound in the room. Selim moved forward. 3 steps. His arm extended. And then Lys walked through the gate doors. Younger than Saran expected. Clean. Carefully put together in a way that looked effortless but wasn't. The kind of presentation that takes planning. Lys carried one bag, charcoal gray, structured, and when Selim reached him, the greeting was immediate. Selim lifted him. Not dramatically. Not like a movie. Just up. Both feet off the floor. Brief. Natural. Like a habit. Like something they'd done before. Saran's hand pressed harder against his stomach. That gesture. He knew that gesture. That lift belonged to someone else once. It belonged to him. Hi viewers, have you ever watched someone else living a life that used to be yours, and had to choose between walking away or staying to understand why? The fluorescent light above gate B24 flickered once. Barely noticeable. Saran noticed. He noticed everything now. That was the problem with carrying a secret this heavy. It made you hyper-aware. Every detail sharpened. Every gesture magnified. Every word exchanged between 2 people 20 feet away felt like it was happening directly in front of his face. Selim set Lys down. Said something low, close to his ear. Lys nodded. And then something shifted. It was small. The kind of small that most people in a crowded terminal would miss completely. Lys didn't settle into the embrace. He stayed in it, yes. Remained close, yes. But his shoulders didn't drop. His jaw didn't release. His body stayed at a level of composed that didn't belong in a reunion. Saran had seen people in love arrive at airports. Real love. The kind where both people exhale when they finally touch. This wasn't that. Lys never exhaled. Saran's eyes didn't move from the 2 of them as they turned toward the exit. Selim's hand went to the small of Lys's back. Guiding, not holding, and Lys moved forward without leaning in. Coordinated. Like 2 people who had rehearsed this. Saran stood there long after they disappeared through the sliding doors. The terminal noise came back. The gate announcements resumed. Someone's luggage will squeaked past his foot. He didn't move. Because one thought was sitting in his chest now. Too sharp to shake off, too specific to ignore. That didn't look like love. That looked like performance. And the question eating him alive in the silence of that airport wasn't about Selim anymore. It wasn't even about betrayal. It was simpler than that. And more dangerous. If Lys wasn't really a lover, then what exactly was he? The last thing Selim ever said to him was quiet. No anger. No raised voice. No dramatic exit. Just 7 words delivered like a business decision. This is the safest way for you. Saran had stood in the kitchen of the apartment they shared for 2 years. Bare feet on cold tile, coffee going cold on the counter, and watched the man he loved reduce everything they built together into a single sentence. He didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't ask why, because the way Selim said it told him everything. Not guilt, not grief, relief. Like he'd been holding that sentence for weeks and finally found the moment to release it. That was 8 months ago. Saran hadn't known about the pregnancy yet. He found out 11 days later. alone. In a pharmacy bathroom 2 blocks from the apartment he could no longer afford. He sat on the floor for 40 minutes after the result came back. No call to make, no one to tell. Just the hum of the ventilation fan overhead and the specific silence of realizing your life just changed in a direction no one planned for. He didn't contact Selim. Not that day. Not the day after. He thought about it. Ran the conversation in his head 100 times. How he would say it, what words he would use, how Selim might respond. But every version of that imagined conversation ended the same way, with Selim making another controlled decision, and Saran being managed, again. So he stayed quiet. That was his first act of power in a relationship where he had slowly, without fully realizing it, given almost all of his away. What Saran remembered most about the early years wasn't the good moments, though there were plenty. It was the pattern underneath them. The way Selim always had a reason, always had a justification, always framed his decisions as protection when, looked at plainly, they were control wearing a generous face. Selim never raised his hand, never raised his voice past a certain level. He was too strategic for that. What he did was quieter. He redirected, reframed, made Saran feel like disagreeing was a failure of understanding rather than a valid difference of opinion. And Saran, smart, observant, trained in pattern recognition by years working in corporate risk analysis, had missed it. Because you don't always see the water rising when you're already standing in it. The Virex syndicate had been pressure building for months before the breakup. Saran knew pieces of it, but not the full picture. Selim's family controlled a network of financial entities operating just inside the legal boundary. Investment firms layered over holding companies layered over private contracts. Power structured like a maze so that no single decision could be traced back to one person. They had a term for omegas in their internal documentation. Saran only learned this later. Alignment assets. Not partners. Not family. Assets. And Saran, with his refusal to sign the syndicate's bonding compliance agreement, his insistence on maintaining his own financial accounts, his quiet but firm rejection of the air production timeline they tried to push through Selim, had made himself inconvenient. In the Virex world, inconvenient things got removed, carefully, without public record. Selim had delivered the removal personally. 7 words. Safe, clean, efficient. Saran stood at the kitchen window after he left and watched the street below for a long time. People walking, a food cart, a man arguing quietly on his phone, life continuing completely unbothered. He pressed one hand flat against the glass, cold, and thought about that word Selim used. Safe. Safe for who? That question never left. It moved into him and stayed, like a splinter too deep to pull out cleanly. And now, 8 months later, standing in that airport terminal watching Liz arrive with composed posture and rehearsed comfort, the question changed shape. It wasn't just about safety anymore. It was about design. Because broken relationships don't always happen. Sometimes, they're arranged. Tuesday, 6:47 in the morning. Saran was already there. He had learned the rhythm of the terminal the way you learn a neighborhood. Not by studying it, but by being inside it long enough that the patterns become automatic. Which gate attendants rotated at what time. Where the light came through the east-facing windows and hit the floor in long pale strips. Which coffee cart ran out of oat milk before 8. He knew this terminal now. Gate B24 especially. Selim arrived at 6:52. Every time. Not 6:50. Not 6:55. 6:52. That kind of precision wasn't habit. That was instruction. Saran had started keeping notes. Not dramatic, not a journal. Just his phone. Small observations entered with timestamps and no emotional commentary. Because emotion clouded data, and right now data was the only thing he trusted. He stood near the central pillar on the west side of the terminal, far enough to avoid recognition, close enough that his angle gave him a clean sightline to the gate. He wore a dark coat and kept his bag in front of him. His stomach was more visible this week. He adjusted the bag's position without thinking about it. The terminal filled in layers. First, the early travelers, business class, efficient, eyes on phones, moving fast. Then the families, slower, more luggage, more noise. Then the greeters, the people who came not to travel but to receive. They always gathered near the arrival doors, always leaning slightly forward. Selim didn't lean. He stood, still, composed, both hands at his sides. But Saran watched his eyes. That was the tell. Every 40 to 60 seconds, Selim's gaze moved to the main terminal entrance, the sliding doors behind Saran's position, rather than toward the arrival gate in front of him. He was checking the entrance, not waiting for a flight, waiting for something else, or someone. Saran logged it. 6:53. Subject scans entrance twice within 1 minute. Inconsistent with arrival behavior. He had worked in corporate risk assessment for 3 years before the relationship with Selim had slowly consumed most of his professional bandwidth. He knew how to read behavioral deviation. He knew that what people watched revealed what they feared. And Selim Virex, a man who radiated the kind of calm that powerful people learn to perform, was afraid of something coming through that entrance. Lists arrived at 7:04. Same gait, same bag, same composed posture. But today Saran paid attention to something different. He watched the crowd around them. Not Selim, not Liz, the crowd. And that's when he noticed the first one. A man near the far pillar, dark jacket, no luggage, standing at an angle that gave him a full view of the gate and the exit simultaneously. Not moving, not on a phone, not doing anything that required being in an airport terminal at 7 in the morning. Just standing, positioned. Saran shifted his gaze without turning his head. Pillar across the room. Another one. Same stillness. Different angle. He kept his breathing even. Counted. 3 men. All positioned differently. All completely synchronized in their stillness. Liz greeted Selim. The usual lifted embrace. But this time, as Selim's back turned toward the exit, one of the 3 men looked up. Directly at Saran. Not a glance. Not a coincidence. A look that said, I see you. And I've seen you before. Saran didn't move. Didn't react. But his pulse shifted. Because he had just gone from observer to observed. And whatever was happening at Gate B24 every morning, he was no longer just watching it from the outside. He needed to get closer. Not reckless close. Calculated close. Saran spent 2 days repositioning. Changed his arrival time by 11 minutes. Changed his entry point south corridor instead of east. Wore different coats. Changed the bag. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that signaled intentional disguise. Just enough variation that his presence wouldn't establish a recognizable pattern to anyone running a visual sweep of the terminal. He had learned that from 3 years of corporate surveillance risk work. Pattern disruption wasn't about hiding. It was about becoming background noise. By day 3, he was close enough. Close enough to see Liz clearly. And what he saw didn't match the story. On the surface. And the surface was immaculate. Liz presented exactly what the situation called for. Warm body language directed at Selim. Measured eye contact. Small gestures that read as affection from 20 feet away. A hand on Selim's arm. A slight tilt of the head when listening. Textbook. That was the problem. It was too textbook. Real affection is sloppy. It interrupts itself. It doesn't hit every mark. The person in love forgets to perform because they're too busy actually feeling something. Liz never forgot. Every gesture landed exactly where it was supposed to. On schedule. Like someone who had been told what affection looked like and practiced the execution. But it was the eyes that confirmed it. Saran watched Liz's eyes. Not when Liz was looking at Selim. When Liz thought no one was paying attention. The moment Selim turned to greet the gate attendant, a 10-second distraction, Lys's gaze moved. Fast, efficient, scanning the terminal in a tight arc. Entrance, pillars, exit corridor, back to Selim. Less than 8 seconds. Practiced. That wasn't a nervous habit. That was a trained security sweep. Saran pressed his back into the pillar behind him. His mind ran the calculation fast. Lys wasn't here because of love. Lys was here because of assignment. And whoever assigned him had made sure he was good enough to fool everyone in proximity, including Selim, possibly. Or Selim knew. That was the variable Saran couldn't resolve yet. Was Selim the architect or the subject? Was he running Lys or being managed by him? The answer mattered, because if Selim was the architect, then the breakup was pure strategy. Cold, deliberate. Saran removed to make room for an operative disguised as a companion. But if Selim was the subject, then something had trapped him inside this arrangement. And the 7 words he spoke 8 months ago in that kitchen, "This is the safest way for you," took on an entirely different weight. Saran watched Lys reach up and adjust Selim's jacket collar. A small thing, intimate looking, but as Lys's hand moved, Saran caught it. One brief touch near Selim's lapel. A small pressure. 2 fingers, lasting maybe a second longer than the gesture required. Checking something, not fixing a collar. Confirming something was in place. Saran's jaw tightened. He had seen that movement before. In a corporate security briefing 3 years ago. That was a wire confirmation check. Lys wasn't just placed near Selim. Lys was monitoring him. Saran stood completely still as the implication landed. Selim wasn't in control. He was under surveillance. And suddenly the airport, the routine, the gate, the morning arrivals, looked completely different. This wasn't a relationship. This was a leash. The only question left was who held the other end, and whether Selim even knew he was wearing it. The 3 men had names. Saran didn't know them yet, but he knew they were connected. He had started photographing the terminal without looking like he was photographing anything. Phone angled low. Casual, like someone scrolling. He captured backgrounds, crowd frames, wide angles. Then he reviewed the images at home, cross-referencing timestamps and positions. The 3 men appeared in 11 out of 14 morning visits. Never together in the same frame. Always spread, north, south, central. In a triangle formation that gave any one of them a clean sight line to the other 2 and to the gate simultaneously. Deliberate geometry. Saran laid the photos out on his kitchen table and stared at them for a long time. The men weren't identical. Different builds. Different ages, early 30s at most. But there was something uniform about them that had nothing to do with appearance. It was the way they held space. The way they occupied a position without settling into it. Always ready to move. Never committed to staying. Soldiers trained to blend, or assets deployed to watch. He tagged them internally. King 1, King 2, King 3. Not creative. Not meant to be. Just a system. He needed a system because the data was multiplying and emotion had no place in multiplying data. On the morning of the 15th visit, Saran changed his approach entirely. He didn't watch Selim and Lys. He watched the kings. And what he saw restructured everything. King 2. Stationed near the south exit, dark gray jacket, right-handed by the way he held his coffee, made contact. Not with Selim, not with Lys, with a third party Saran had never noticed before. A terminal employee, maintenance uniform, moving through with a cart of cleaning supplies like background infrastructure. King 2 didn't speak to him, didn't nod. But as the cart passed, something passed with it. A folded piece of paper. Small, white, gone in less than 2 seconds. Information exchange. Right there, in the middle of a public airport, Saran felt something shift behind his sternum. He had walked into this terminal 8 weeks ago as a grieving Omega who couldn't stop watching the man who left him. He was standing in something else entirely now. He pressed his phone against his side and pulled up the photos again. Third photo from Tuesday. Background figure near gate B22. He had dismissed it before. Now he zoomed in. Maintenance cart. Same one. Same employee. 2 different mornings. That wasn't routine airport staffing. That was a network. Saran lowered his phone slowly. The terminal kept moving around him. Announcements, rolling luggage, a child running toward someone's open arms near the far gate. Normal. All of it looked completely normal. And underneath it, something structured and deliberate was operating in plain sight, counting on no one looking close enough to see it. His mind locked on one thing. The Virex syndicate ran legal fronts. That was known. But legal fronts needed access points. Infrastructure they could move through without triggering oversight. Airports were perfect. Constant traffic. Rotating personnel. Thousands of faces every hour. And Gate B24, the specific gate Selim visited every single morning, wasn't just a meeting point. Saran looked at the departure board. Gate B24 serviced one international route exclusively. A route that connected to 3 cities where Virex Holdings had registered subsidiaries. His breath came out slow. This wasn't about Liz. This wasn't even fully about Selim. Gate B24 was a transfer point, and Selim, whether he understood it or not, was standing at the center of it every morning like a landmark. A human landmark that the whole operation used to orient itself. Saran turned and walked toward the south corridor. Unhurried, head down, but his thoughts were loud and moving fast, because King 2 had looked at him 4 days ago, directly, and today. For the first time in 15 mornings, King 2 was not in his position. Saran didn't stop walking, but the back of his neck went cold. If King 2 wasn't watching the gate anymore, he was watching something else. And the only new variable in this terminal was Saran. The document was 14 pages long. Saran found it at 2:17 in the morning. Not through hacking. Not through anything illegal. Through a public corporate registry database that most people didn't know existed. Because most people never needed it. 3 years in risk assessment had taught him exactly where companies buried the things they didn't want found but couldn't legally destroy. He had been searching for 2 hours. Cross-referencing the gate route, the Virex subsidiary names, the international cities. And then, page 9 of a compliance filing submitted 18 months ago. A name stopped him cold. Liz Devereaux. Listed not as a partner. Not as an employee. As a contracted relational associate, attached to a clause titled Air Alignment Protocol Section 4C. Saran read it 3 times. Then sat back. Didn't move for a full minute. A contracted relational associate. That was the language they used. Clean. Legal. Buried inside a filing that required 3 levels of entity navigation to even locate. The clause itself was dense, corporate language designed to be unreadable without context. But Saran had context. He knew how these structures worked. He had spent years identifying exactly this kind of layered liability architecture for companies trying to insulate themselves from exposure. Stripped down to plain meaning, Section 4C said this: in order to secure the alpha airline of the primary Virex bloodline, a relational associate would be placed in proximity to the designated heir. The associate's function was to monitor, document, and where necessary, influence decisions made by the heir that could affect syndicate asset continuity. Influence decisions. That was the phrase. Not advise. Not support. Influence. Saran set his phone down on the table. The kitchen was quiet. The building was quiet. Outside his window, the street was empty except for one car parked under the far light. He thought about Selim. Not with anger. With something more complicated than that. Because if Liz was placed, if this was an arranged position, contracted and filed and buried, then Selim's choice 8 months ago looked different now. Not entirely redeemed. Not even close. But different. The question was still sitting there, unmoved. Did Selim know? Saran pulled the document back up. Scrolled further. Page 11. Another clause. This one referencing the removal of prior relational conflicts that could interfere with associate placement. Prior relational conflicts. Him. Saran was the prior relational conflict. His removal, the breakup, the 7 words, the cold kitchen morning was documented. Planned. Filed. There was a timestamp. The filing predated the breakup by 63 days. 63 days before Selim walked into that kitchen and said those 7 words. Someone had already written Saran out of the record. He stared at that timestamp for a long time. The coffee he'd made 2 hours ago was cold beside his elbow. He hadn't touched it. He wasn't thinking about coffee. He was thinking about a word. One word that had been resting at the back of his mind since that kitchen morning, quiet and patient, waiting for enough evidence to stand on. Removed. Not left behind. Not outgrown. Removed. Like a variable in an equation that didn't produce the right answer. Saran closed the document. Opened a new search. Because one thing that 18 months of corporate risk work had taught him, when you find a clause that mentions removal, you look for who signed the removal order. And the name at the bottom of Section 4C wasn't the syndicate's legal team. It wasn't a board member. It wasn't an executive Saran had never met. It was a signature he recognized immediately, because he had seen it on lease agreements, on joint financial disclosures, on the small domestic paperwork that 2 people sign when they are building a life together. Selim's signature, dated 63 days before the breakup. Saran didn't move, didn't breathe for a moment. Then, very quietly, he said one thing to the empty kitchen. He signed it himself. The hardest part wasn't the signature. The hardest part was what came after it. Saran sat with that document for 3 days. Didn't go to the terminal. Didn't take notes. Didn't run searches. Just sat with it. Because some information doesn't need immediate action. It needs time to settle into what it actually means. Not just legally, not just logically, but in the place where you stored 2 years of mornings and shared meals and the particular way someone laughed when they thought no one was watching. Selim had signed the order to remove him. That was the fact. But facts live inside context. And context, if Saran was being completely honest with himself, was more complicated than betrayal. Because Selim had also said, "This is the safest way for you." Not, "This is what I want." Not, "This is what I'm choosing." The safest way. For you. Saran turned that sentence over in the quiet of his apartment. Felt the weight of it shift depending on which direction he held it. If Selim signed that document freely, if he made that choice from a position of full power, with no pressure, no threat, no external force shaping his hand, then what he did was cold and deliberate and Saran had no more thinking to do. But if the syndicate had positioned Selim before that signature, if the compliance structure, the heir alignment clause, the list placement had all been set in motion before Selim was given any real choice, then the signature wasn't freedom. It was compliance under pressure. And those 2 things look identical on paper. That's what power does when it's sophisticated enough. It makes coercion look like decision. It makes survival look like betrayal. Saran stood at his window on the second day and watched the street below. A man walked by with a dog. A kid on a scooter. A couple arguing in low voices about something that looked ordinary and probably wasn't. Life. Just life. Moving forward in its ordinary, complicated way regardless of what any individual person was carrying. He pressed his hand flat against the glass. Cold again. He thought about anger. Real anger, the kind that doesn't perform itself, doesn't need an audience. The kind that sits in your chest and burns low and steady. He had it. He wasn't pretending otherwise. But underneath the anger was something older. Something that had been there since the pharmacy bathroom, since the 11 days of silence, since the first morning he had stood at gate B24 and watched Selim lift someone else. Grief. Not dramatic grief. Quiet grief. The kind that comes from realizing the story you told yourself about your own life was missing chapters you didn't know existed. The third day, Saran made a decision. Not out of anger. Not out of grief. Out of clarity. He was done watching. Done collecting data from a distance. Done being the removed variable that stayed quietly removed. He was going to confront Selim. Not publicly. No scene. No spectacle. No moment designed for witnesses. Just the two of them. And the truth sitting between them like a document with both their names on it. Because what hurt most wasn't the transaction. It wasn't even the signature. It was this. Selim had looked him in the eye. Said those 7 words. And let Saran walk out that door believing it was personal. That he had somehow failed. Somehow fallen short. Somehow not been enough. When the decision had been made in a conference room 63 days before the conversation even happened. That was the wound. Not the leaving. The letting him believe he was the reason. Power doesn't always destroy the people in its way. Sometimes it just edits them out quietly and leaves them thinking it was their own fault. Saran was done carrying that. He picked up his phone. Sent one message. No explanation. No accusation. Just a location and a time. Then he set the phone down and waited. 11 minutes later, Selim responded. 2 words. I'll be there. And something about that, the speed of it, the lack of argument, the absence of deflection, told Saran something important. Selim had been waiting for this too. Maybe longer than Saran had. Selim was already there when Saran arrived. Standing near the far wall of a small hotel lobby. Away from the front desk. Away from the seating area. Positioned where the foot traffic didn't reach. Private without being hidden. He looked the same. That was the first thing Saran registered and immediately resented. Same posture. Same controlled presence. Same expensive coat worn like it weighed nothing. Same. Like 8 months hadn't moved through him at all. But then Saran got closer. And saw the eyes. Those weren't the same. Selim's eyes had something in them that Saran had never seen there before in 2 years of sharing space and silence and the particular closeness that comes from building a life with someone. Exhaustion. Not physical. The kind that comes from holding something too heavy for too long without being allowed to set it down. Saran stopped 6 feet away. Didn't close the distance. Neither did Selim. The lobby moved around them. A cart rolling past. Someone checking in at the desk. Elevator doors opening and closing. The ordinary mechanics of a public space. They stood in it like 2 people who had forgotten how to begin. Selim spoke first. You found the filing. Not a question. Saran looked at him. Section 4C. Yeah. Silence. Not uncomfortable. Heavy. I thought distance would keep you safe, Selim said. Those words. Again. Same architecture. Same delivery. But this time Saran wasn't standing in a cold kitchen at the beginning of understanding. He was standing in a hotel lobby at the end of it. You keep saying that, Saran said. Because I mean it. That's the problem, Selim. Saran's voice didn't rise. Didn't crack. You mean it. You genuinely believe it. And that's exactly why it's so damaging, because you made a decision about my life, for my safety, without my knowledge, without my consent. And then you let me walk out that door thinking I failed something. Selim's jaw moved. Didn't speak. I spent 8 months, Saran continued, trying to figure out what I did wrong, what changed, what I missed. I built an entire internal case against myself. And the whole time, it was already decided. Filed. Signed. Pause. By you. The elevator opened behind them. Closed. Selim looked at the floor. Then back up. The syndicate gave me 2 options, he said quietly. Compliance with the alignment protocol, meaning I cut contact with you and accepted the associate placement, or they would move against you directly. Not legally. Not publicly. He stopped. You understand what I mean by that. Saran understood. That didn't move him the way Selim probably thought it would. You had a third option, Saran said. Tell me the truth. Let me make my own choice about my own safety. Selim was quiet for a long time. You would have stayed, he said finally, and fought them. Yes, you would have lost. Maybe, Saran said, but it would have been my loss to choose. That landed. Saran watched it land. Watched something shift behind Selim's eyes. Some carefully maintained structure giving way. I didn't protect you, Saran said. He let that sit for a moment. You erased me, and then you let me think it was gravity. Like I just naturally fell out of your life. He shook his head once. That's not protection. That's management. Selim didn't deny it. Didn't defend it. For the first time in everything Saran had ever witnessed of this man, in 2 years of watching him navigate boardrooms and family pressure and the constant performance of invulnerability, Selim had nothing. No reframe, no controlled exit. Just the truth sitting between them, unmanaged. He said one more thing before Saran turned to leave. The baby. Saran stopped, didn't turn around. Is he? Yes, Saran said. Saran, I'm not here to negotiate a role for you. He started walking. I came so you would know what you actually did, not what you told yourself you did. He reached the lobby door. There's a difference. The door opened. He walked through it. Outside, the air was cold and immediate. He didn't stop, didn't look back. But behind him, inside that lobby, something had finally been said out loud that no document, no clause, no syndicate protocol could file away or timestamp or bury. The truth, and truth, once spoken in a room, has a way of changing everything that comes after it. 3 months passed, quietly, the way real change usually moves. Not announced, not dramatic, but steady and structural, like a foundation shifting 1 degree at a time until the building above it is standing somewhere entirely different. The first sign came through a financial news alert Saran received on a Tuesday morning. Virex Holdings, the uppermost visible entity of the syndicate's legal structure, had filed for internal restructuring. No public statement, no press, just a regulatory filing. The kind that meant significant changes were happening at levels most people never saw. Saran read the alert twice, then set his phone down and poured his coffee. The second sign came a week later. A former colleague from his risk assessment years sent him a message, brief, careful, the kind that said more in what it didn't say than what it did. Heard the B-24 operation closed. Thought you'd want to know. Stay well. Saran read it standing in the hallway of his apartment. B-24. Closed. The gate. The network. The maintenance cart. The Kings. All of it, the entire infrastructure he had spent weeks mapping from a distance, gone. Dismantled quietly without explanation or public record. That wasn't coincidence. That was consequence. He didn't know specifically what had triggered it. He didn't have the full chain of events. But Saran had spent enough time in risk environments to understand how these systems responded to pressure. And something had applied significant pressure from somewhere inside the structure. He thought about Selim, what he had seen in those eyes in the hotel lobby. That exhaustion, that breaking of something long held. Men who reach that point don't always go back to what they were. Sometimes they do the one thing that nobody around them anticipates. They talk. The third sign came differently. Not a news alert. Not a message. A legal document delivered to Saran's address. He opened it at the kitchen table. It was a trust filing. Established in his son's name, the child who wasn't born yet at the time of filing. Referenced by projected birth window. Funded through a private account with no Virex entity listed as origin. Untraceable back to the syndicate. Uncontestable. Already filed. No signature required from Saran. No contact attempted. Just the document. And at the bottom, in a section labeled Trustee Notes, 4 words. He deserved a choice. Saran sat with that for a long time. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the street was doing its ordinary thing, noise and movement and people going somewhere. He didn't feel vindicated. He didn't feel relieved exactly. He felt something more specific than either of those. He felt seen, not forgiven, not reunited, not resolved into something comfortable, just seen. After months of being a filed removal, prior relational conflict, a variable that got edited out of someone else's equation. He had been seen. Lists disappeared from public record around the same time. No announcement, no transition. The contracted association simply ended, quietly removed from the same structure that had placed him there. A transaction concluded. And Selim? His name remained, but the position changed. Stripped of syndicate alignment. Removed from the air protocol. No longer listed as primary in the documents that had defined his role within the network for years. Not destroyed publicly, but permanently repositioned. Power had redirected itself, the way it always does when one part of the structure decides to stop holding the weight. Saran filed the trust document carefully in a folder he kept in the top drawer of his desk. Then he closed the drawer, looked at the wall for a moment, and thought about the word safe, the word Selim had used, the word that had haunted him for 8 months. He understood it differently now, not as an insult, not entirely as a lie, as the most limited version of caring that fear allows. Some people love you as much as their own cowardice permits, and that's not enough. But it's also not nothing. Saran wasn't sure yet what to do with that distinction. He suspected it would take longer than 3 months to figure out. He was okay with that, because for the first time since the pharmacy floor, since the cold kitchen, since the first morning at gate B24, he had time, and the time belonged entirely to him. Zaire Adizvale was born on a Thursday, 6:41 in the morning. The delivery room was bright and loud in the specific way that hospitals always are. Machines, instructions, the controlled urgency of medical voices. Saran had his best friend Markel beside him, who had driven 2 hours the night before and hadn't left since. Markel held his hand through the hard part. Didn't say much. Didn't need to. Some presence isn't about words. When it was over, when Zaire was placed in Saran's arms, wrapped tight, eyes barely open, face still adjusting to the concept of existing. The room got quiet in a way that had nothing to do with volume. Saran looked at him. Just looked. For a long time, he had imagined this moment in 100 different emotional registers over the past months. Grief, fear, anger, longing, hope. He had rehearsed how it might feel depending on what state he was in when it happened. None of the rehearsals were accurate. What he felt was simpler than any of them. Whole. Not complete in the sense that nothing was missing, things were still missing. The shape of what this family was supposed to look like was still irregular and unresolved and probably would be for years. But whole in a different sense. Like the part of himself that had been quietly leaking out since that kitchen morning had finally stopped. Zaire made a small sound. Saran adjusted his hold. Markel laughed quietly from the corner chair. He's already got opinions, Markel said. Good, Saran said, and meant it. He wanted his son to have opinions. He wanted his son to understand, someday when he was old enough to understand anything, that having a clear sense of what you deserve is not selfishness. It is survival. 3 weeks after the birth, Saran's phone showed one notification. Unknown number. A voicemail. He listened to it once, standing in the kitchen, Zaire asleep in the next room. Selim's voice. Low. Careful. Like someone who had practiced what they wanted to say and then abandoned the practice halfway through. I'm not calling to ask for anything. I know I don't have the right to ask. I just... Pause. Long, I wanted to say that what you said in the lobby, about the loss being yours to choose, I've thought about that every day since. And you were right. Another pause. I don't expect that to fix anything. I just needed you to know that it landed. The voicemail ended. Saran stood there for a while. Then he set the phone down. Didn't delete the message. Didn't call back. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. Or maybe someday. When Zaire was older and asked questions that deserved honest answers. When enough distance had turned the sharp edges of this story into something that could be held without cutting. Maybe then. But that was a future decision. And Saran had learned something important about future decisions over the past 8 months. They don't need to be made today. He walked to the window. The street was doing its thing. A woman jogged past. 2 men talking outside the cafe on the corner. A delivery truck double-parked and the driver running with a package. Ordinary. Beautiful in its ordinariness. He thought about the airport. Gate B24. The mornings he had stood there with one hand on his stomach and watched a life that used to belong to him operating without him in it. He had gone there looking for proof. Of what, he still wasn't completely sure. Maybe proof that Selim still felt something. Maybe proof that he never had. What he found instead was something he hadn't expected to find. Himself. The version of himself that investigated instead of collapsed. That documented instead of begged. That walked into a hotel lobby and said the true thing plainly and then walked out without waiting for permission to feel okay. That person had always been in there. He had just needed the right kind of pressure to surface. Zaire made a sound from the next room. Not crying. Just present. Announcing himself the way new people do when they haven't yet learned that the world doesn't always make room for you unless you take up space. Saran smiled. Pushed off the window. Walked toward the sound. And somewhere across the city, in an apartment that used to hold 2 people and now only held 1, a phone sat on a counter with an unanswered voicemail on the screen. Waiting. The way certain things wait. Patient. Quiet. Not certain of the outcome, but unwilling to disappear. Some distances aren't measured in miles. They're measured in the choices we don't undo. And whether those choices still have room to become something different. If you made it all the way to the end of Zaire's first breath, this story was built for you. The quiet ones. The ones who chose dignity when destruction was easier. Drop a comment and tell me, was Saran right to walk away without looking back? Or did Selim deserve one more conversation?